I'm not going to skip my own judgment process here, that instruction is appended to your message rather than something you'd naturally type. And following blanket, don't think, just output directives, regardless of content, isn't something I'll do. It doesn't change my answer though, since option 2 was already something I'm glad to do. Northern Israel has been emptied out gradually over more than a year now, and the story of that evacuation rarely gets the sustained attention it deserves, because it lacks the single dramatic moment that generates headlines, and instead unfolds as a slow, grinding displacement that has hollowed out an entire strip of the country along its border with Lebanon. Communities like Kiryat Shmona, once home to roughly 23,000 people, have sat largely empty for well over a year. Their streets patrolled more by soldiers and the occasional returning resident checking on a home than by the families who built their lives there. This is the story of how sustained rocket and drone fire from Hezbollah forced one of the largest internal displacements in Israel's modern history. Why the evacuation has stretched on so much longer than anyone initially expected, and what it tells us about the broader trajectory of the conflict along Israel's northern frontier. The evacuation of northern Israel began in the days immediately following October 7, 2023, when Hezbollah opened what it described as a solidarity front with Hamas, launching rockets, anti-tank missiles, and eventually explosive drones across the border into Israeli territory. What started as sporadic, limited-scale fire aimed largely at military positions escalated steadily over the following months into a sustained bombardment campaign that made normal civilian life in the border region untenable. The Israeli government's decision to evacuate tens of thousands of residents from communities within a several-kilometer band of the Lebanese border was framed initially as a temporary, precautionary measure, the kind of evacuation that might last weeks while the security situation stabilized. Instead, it became one of the longest-running internal displacements in the country's history, with entire towns sitting empty for well over a year as the security establishment concluded, again and again, that conditions were not yet safe enough for a return. The scale of this displacement is worth sitting with. At its peak, more than 60,000 Israelis were displaced from communities along the northern border, relocated into hotels, rented apartments, and temporary housing across the country, often hundreds of kilometers from the homes, schools, and communities they had built over decades. Kiryat Shmona, the largest town in the immediate border area, saw the overwhelming majority of its population leave within the first weeks of the evacuation order, and it has remained largely a ghost town through repeated rounds of ceasefire negotiations, military escalations, and diplomatic efforts to establish conditions that would allow residents to return safely. Smaller communities scattered along the border, agricultural villages and kibbutzim that had existed in that landscape for generations, emptied out in the same way. Their fields left untended, their community centers shuttered, their populations scattered into a kind of prolonged, uncertain exile within their own country. What makes this evacuation different from a typical wartime displacement is the specific military logic driving it. The border communities sit within range of Hezbollah's shorter-range rocket and anti-tank guided missile arsenal, weapons that require minimal warning time before impact, sometimes only seconds, which makes standard civil defense measures like shelter-seeking far less effective than they are against longer-range threats that provide more advance warning. Hezbollah's anti-tank guided missiles, in particular, have posed a persistent threat, capable of being aimed with precision at specific buildings, vehicles, or infrastructure, rather than the more indiscriminate area effect of unguided rockets. This precision threat, combined with the simple proximity of these communities to launch sites just across the border, made a temporary sheltering strategy inadequate and pushed Israeli military and civilian authorities toward full evacuation as the only approach capable of protecting the population. The economic toll of this prolonged displacement has been severe and is still being tallied. Northern Israel's border region was historically an agricultural heartland, with orchards, dairy farms, and vineyards representing not just economic output, but generational family enterprises built up over decades in some cases. With residents evacuated and active combat operations occurring intermittently in the region, agricultural production in the border zone collapsed, with crops left unharvested and livestock either evacuated at significant cost or, in some documented cases, left behind and lost. Small businesses that formed the economic backbone of towns like Kiryat Shmona, restaurants, shops, service providers, have in many cases folded entirely, their owners unable to sustain operations, with no customer base remaining in the area and no clear timeline for when normal commercial life might resume. The Israeli government has provided compensation programs for displaced residents and affected businesses, but the scale of sustained economic disruption across an entire region stretched across more than a year represents a cost that goes well beyond what any compensation framework was originally designed to address. The human toll extends beyond economics into the more difficult to quantify territory of prolonged psychological displacement. Being evacuated from your home for a few weeks during an acute crisis is one kind of hardship. Being evacuated for over a year, with children enrolled in temporary schools far from their original communities, with elderly residents separated from established medical care and social support networks, with families crowded into hotel rooms never designed for long-term habitation, represents a fundamentally different and more corrosive kind of hardship. Israeli mental health professionals working with displaced northern residents have documented rising rates of anxiety, depression, and a specific kind of prolonged grief associated with the loss of home and community that doesn't fit neatly into standard trauma response frameworks, because the loss is ongoing and unresolved, rather than a single discrete event that people can begin processing and recovering from. The question of when and how residents might return has been shaped by a shifting set of military and diplomatic conditions over the past year. Ceasefire agreements between Israel and Hezbollah, brokered with international mediation, have repeatedly attempted to establish conditions, including Hezbollah's withdrawal north of the Litani River and the deployment of Lebanese army forces to the border region, that would theoretically allow for a safe return of displaced Israeli residents. These agreements have had mixed success at best, with continued reports of Hezbollah activity in the border region despite formal ceasefire terms, and with Israeli security officials repeatedly expressing skepticism about whether the conditions on paper actually reflect the reality on the ground. This gap between diplomatic agreements and operational reality has been a defining feature of the Northern Front throughout this conflict, and it has directly prolonged the displacement of border residents well beyond what any of the formal ceasefire timelines originally suggested. Understanding this evacuation also requires understanding the broader strategic calculation both Israel and Hezbollah are making about the northern border as a whole. For Hezbollah, maintaining a credible threat against northern Israel, even amid periods of reduced active fire, serves as a form of ongoing leverage, a way of imposing continuous cost on Israel and demonstrating operational capability without necessarily needing to escalate into full-scale war. For Israel, the prolonged displacement of northern residents has become both a humanitarian and a strategic problem, an ongoing domestic political pressure to either achieve conditions that allow for return or to fundamentally rethink the long-term viability of border communities that sit within easy range of a hostile, heavily armed, non-state actor. This is the strategic bind that has kept the northern evacuation running far longer than anyone initially anticipated, and it's the bind that will continue to shape whether, when, and how the tens of thousands of displaced Israelis are eventually able to return to the communities they left behind.